Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II Podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. When the French capitulated in 1940 and the Vichy government came to power, many of the French colonial possessions remained loyal to the new regime. The same was true for the island of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. In this episode, I'm joined by Russell Phillips. Russell's book, A Strange Campaign, narrates the story of the Battle for Madagascar, where British troops would fight the French for possession of the island. It's a curious corner of the war, which I have to admit I wasn't aware of until Russell pointed it out. But before we get started, just to remind you, if you enjoy the podcast every few weeks, why not help me to put the show together with a small recurring donation each month of $1 or so. It's easy to do via Patreon or PayPal, and you can find the details at patreon.com/WW2 Podcast or WW2podcast.com/donate. Those small contributions help me find the time to do this show for you. And it's a surprising amount of time I have to put into researching, recording and editing, and then the website and social media. I do try to give something extra to supporters of the podcast by releasing exclusive bits that were left on the virtual cutting room floor, which I hope might be of interest. So that's patreon.com/WW2 Podcast or WW2podcast.com/donate to sign up via PayPal or Patreon. Russell, it's nice to have you back. Let's start with the island of Madagascar. Was it of any strategic importance?
So, yeah, it's in the Indian Ocean off the east coast of Africa. It's ideally situated to enable forces there could intercept convoys coming around the Horn of Africa to India and the Far East. And Diego Suarez is a huge naval base, which the French had improved somewhat. So the big fear was that the Japanese would base a large naval force there.
I envisioned it being quite a small island, and actually it's big. Nearly 600,000 square kilometres, according to Wikipedia. It's a substantial piece of real estate. So when France falls in 1940, obviously the French colonies, cause it's French, isn't it? It go in all kinds of directions. Where does Madagascar's loyalty go?
At the time, the governor was a guy called Jules Marcel de Coppet. He appeared to favour de Gaulle, but he didn't decisively go where with the Free French. He was kind of, but he seemed to go in that direction. But then the Mersel Kabir attack happened and all of that.
That's where the British sinks the French fleet because the French refused to give it up.
Yeah, and that soured an awful lot of French people against the British. And he seemed to be less in favour of the Free French after that. He never really decisively went one way or the other. And the Vichy authorities decided that basically they couldn't trust him. So they replaced him initially with a guy called Leon Kayler, but then he got ill and had to retire. And so they ended up with a guy called Armand Annette, who was, or possibly Anne, I'm not sure my French pronunciation. He was the governor for the rest of the time.
So does Germany have any interest, or in Japan, the Axis powers, do they have any interest in Madagascar, or do they just sort of leave it to the Vichy to do what they want with it?
Well, the Germans, their first idea for the final solution to the Jewish problem, to use their phrase, was to deport the Jews to Madagascar. We'll just send them all to Madagascar and they can live on that island and then they're not here. The Japanese didn't seem to have a great deal of interest, really.
It's probably a bit too far out of what was deemed to be their sphere of interest.
They did start getting further into the Indian Ocean. You can certainly see how if they're going to take India and Ceylon and places like that, then Madagascar would make some sense, but it's a long way away from Japan.
Yes, but it'd be good, as you say, it would make an excellent base for raiding anything around the Horn of Africa or going north up to the Gulf of Aden as things come through the Suez Canal and into the Arabian Sea for a staging post. But anyway, so yeah, and the fact it's slightly random, the Germans thinking they might deport all their Jewish populations there. It's a very random thing to come up with to halfway around the world.
I don't know why Madagascar was the place they thought. I mean, maybe it's just because it's an island and therefore it'd be harder for them to get back off and get back to Europe. I don't know. It's not something I've really looked into.
So did the British have any great, it's sort of sat there, it's Vichy France. How much of a threat is it really? How much did the British have any interest in Madagascar? Was it causing them any problems?
Not really. Churchill always had an idea that it was going to be a problem. He was always the one who was like, so Madagascar then, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and so on were just like, yeah, it's relevant, don't worry about it. Churchill always had this idea that somebody could base naval forces at Diego Suarez and then they could cause problems with convoys, which, naval forces based there absolutely could cause problems for naval convoys. Churchill seemed convinced that somebody was going to do that, especially after Pearl Harbor. But the rest of the British generally didn't consider it a problem. It's worth mentioning that Jan Smuts, who was the South African Prime Minister, he kept pushing to occupy Madagascar. His idea was always to take the whole island, whereas Churchill just wanted Diego Suarez. And de Gaulle was quite keen to take it as well. But de Gaulle wanted the Free French to be involved, of course.
I'm just oddly enough reading about Alanbrooke and at the moment he's commenting how Churchill was obsessing over it and he was not keen at all. But they do change their mind. What changes the Allies' mind to occupy the port? The
final thing was that there was some talk between the Germans and the Japanese. I think the Germans had poked the Japanese and said, you should really base some submarines or something on Madagascar. The Vichy French will do it because we'll tell them to. And to be fair to the French, they were in no position to tell the Japanese no. The Americans decoded Japanese signals going to Germany because they'd broken the Japanese codes. So they saw that they were talking about this, and that's the thing that finally pushed the Allies into acting on it.
Were the Americans keen on occupying Madagascar? Where did they sit in it all?
They didn't want to fight the Vichy French. They had good diplomatic relations with Vichy, and they didn't want to do anything at this point. They didn't want to do anything to damage that. They refused to be involved in the actual operation, but Churchill did persuade them to give the British some ships to take over duties that British ships were doing so that those British ships could then be involved in the operation.
The Americans supply ships for the home fleet. The home fleet goes to the Mediterranean ships go to the... It's some weird game of chess like that, isn't it? So the Americans are not seen to be involved. It's quite complicated way of showing their aid without doing anything. So Operation Ironclad, it's a great name, was the plan to invade the island. But it's not all the island. It really is a limited operation, is Ironclad, wasn't it?
And Churchill had this idea that it was supposed to be a help and not a hindrance. And he thought if they tried to take the whole island, it would be a big operation. It would be, a bigger operation, and it'd be a long campaign, and that was too much. And I think he thought that Diego Suarez was the important thing, so they could just land in the north, take Diego Suarez, it'd all be over fairly quickly, and then they could carry on with the rest of the war. That was their plan. It's worth noting, though, that the plan was never to attack Diego Suarez directly. The plan was always to land on the western side of the island, on the north side, but on the west, and then march overland and take Diego Suarez from the land side.
Is there any significant logistical problems facing the British? Because what struck me was when I was reading about it, was actually the size of the invasion force. It's sizable. It's big.
The naval force there was a battleship, 2 carriers, and then a bunch of cruisers, a lot of destroyers, minesweepers, corvette, and then all the amphibious ships and so on. It was a big operation, and the land forces were 3 infantry brigades and an army commando. 2 of those brigades were intended for India, and I think it was Waverley in the Far East was not very happy that they weren't going straight to him and they were stopping off at Madagascar first.
We're mid-42, aren't we? So we're running up to things like Alamein. The Japanese are still in the ascent in Burma.
And of course, the planning for all this is like at the start of 1942. So, at that point, the Japanese are still, as you say, they're very much in the ascent, and the Allies are scrambling to stop them.
Had the French expected an Allied attack? I mean, are these opposed the landings that the British make? Well, it's not the British; it's a sort of a polyglot force, isn't it?
At this point, it's British. No, the French didn't really expect it, and you can't hide the fact that there's this massive naval force going down the west coast of Africa and around South Africa. But there were a lot of deception operations to suggest that they were actually going somewhere else. There was talk about them going to India, which of course was sensible, logical, and eventually they were going there. And there was talk of them going to Alexandria, and they quite deliberately not involved the Free French at all because of security concerns. There had been security lapses around the Mers el-Kabir operation, and so the British very carefully kept the French out of it. But they did, when they were stopped at various ports, they would apparently indiscreetly mention where they were heading, but they'd mention destinations like Alexandria or Mombasa or somewhere like that. There was an awful lot of deception going on to stop the French thinking they're going to Madagascar.
Yeah, I imagine there must have been a lot of traffic up and down there, as you say. So it must be relatively normal. So, what forces do the French have, if you're not necessarily expecting an attack? Obviously, Vichy France is technically not really part of the war, but what troops do they have defending the island?
It's also worth noting that the Germans hadn't allowed Vichy France to reinforce Madagascar because sometime before, the Special Operations Executive had agents on the island, and one in particular, a woman called Bertha Meyer, had reported on a set of merchant ships leaving, and that allowed the Royal Navy to intercept them and capture them. And when the Germans found out, they were convinced that the French communications weren't secure, and they wouldn't allow Vichy France to send any reinforcements to Madagascar. They had a mixed regiment there, supporting artillery. There were quite a few coastal batteries around Diego Suarez itself, and a smaller one where the landings were. And they had a few armoured cars. I think it was a squadron of armoured cars, something like that, but quite a bit of artillery. A lot of it was quite old, but good size, 65, 75 millimetre, that sort of size.
So the British landings go quite well, don't they? The initial landings.
They went really well. They landed at night, which the French were convinced was impossible. So they weren't actually manning their defences. They were basically all asleep. They managed it because the SOE had got a small boat, which they set in a particular place to guide the landing forces in, so they could actually get through the approaches without landing on sandbanks and things. And also, one of the agents on the island cut the telephone link between the batteries on the west coast to Diego Suarez, so they weren't able to alert Diego Suarez when the landing started. There was some opposition, but not a great deal, and quite a few of the defenders were found in their beds.
Part of me thinks, oh well, that's they're faced with formidable opposition. They surrender, but they don't surrender, do they? Sort of, the Allies have to fight their way to Diego Suarez.
For all that they weren't prepared, and I say some of them were still in bed, they did put up opposition once they realised what was going on. There were a couple of battles on the way to Diego Suarez.
There is that defensive line. The French fall back to, is it the Joffre line?
Yeah, that was
around the port.
Yes, it was a significant line. There were like forts and an anti-tank ditch and artillery positions, but it was very well camouflaged. So there had been quite a number of aerial reconnaissance missions that just hadn't seen it. And on the maps that the British had, it was labelled with a word like ouvre, I think it is, which literally translates to works. And the British thought that meant it was like industrial works or something, whereas it actually meant defensive works. So that kind of took them by surprise.
There's a formidable defences, and there's a wonderful quote about it being a rerun of the Battle of Balaclava for the tanks. So what happens when they're trying to put in their attacks?
The advance to Diego Suez got held up at a place called Col de Bonne Nouvelle. But once they'd got past that, the tanks charged off ahead. You interviewed a person a while ago about Allied armour, and I remember him saying that at this time they were still training armoured crews to do like the cavalry charge, and that's exactly what happened here. They're like, they'd got that fight under control. The infantry were just finishing everything off, and the tanks went, right, we'll go off and take Diego Suez, and they charged off and met these artillery and anti-tank guns, and half of the tanks were Tetrarch light tanks, which, just aren't...
They get used as airborne tanks, don't they? They fly them in on the gliders. So when you say they're light tanks, they are, they're light enough to put on a glider.
And they had Valentines with them, but even the Valentines got knocked out.
It did make me chuckle when rerun of Balaclava. I was thinking back to those desert campaigns where they, don't quite know what to do, so let's just charge. Rather than sort of think up some sort of tactical way of getting around them. So who puts in the final attack on the port? Is it the boys coming from the land? Because there's another attack goes in from, is it HMS Anthony from the sea?
When the infantry came up, they tried a straightforward frontal attack and got nowhere. So General Sturgis, the Royal Marine Commander who was in charge, he set up a plan for one battalion, I think it was the South Lancashires, to work their way around the flank of the Joffre line and attack from there. He was really concerned that they weren't going to take Diego Suez quickly enough, and if it took too long, then of course there's like the rest of the Vichy forces on Madagascar could come up and hit them. So he requested a force of Royal Marines, and there were 50 Royal Marines were transferred from the battleship that they normally lived on to HMS Anthony, which is a little destroyer. And Anthony went into Diego Suez. It literally ran the gauntlet. It was during the night, so it was dark. This was expected to be a suicide mission. They were expecting like 50-60% casualties among the Royal Marines. And Anthony wasn't expected to get out of it. But she literally ran into Diego Suez at 20-odd knots, missed the jetty, had to turn round, and the Royal Marines basically ran off HMS Anthony over the depth charges at the back, and then she ran out again and didn't get hit at all. Either there was an artillery crew manhandled their gun onto the jetty, fired at Anthony at point blank range and missed. And she was so quick, they only got off that one shot. And then the Marines ran into Diego Suez, and their brief was basically to cause a disruption and make the French think that there was a much bigger force landed behind them, which they did absolutely well. And the South Lancashires were also doing quite a good job. But the South Lancashires hadn't been able they'd lost radio contact with the rest of the brigade. So Sturgis thought they'd all been captured, which is part of why he was so concerned about how this was going to go. That's what allowed them to take Diego Suez.
That fantastic little operation by 50 Marines causing all that confusion. They surrendered. Now, essentially, they've achieved what they set out to do. They're holding the port, but it's not the island. So they've curtailed potential use of the naval facilities. Are the French in any move to change side?
No, not at all. Their attitude seems to have been that they didn't really like the French or the British. Later on in the campaign, the French would get the locals to help them make roadblocks to stop the British. And then the British would come along and get the locals to help them move the roadblocks so that they could carry on. The French, there was a lot of ill feeling towards the British anyway. And all the French, Vichy and Free French, were very suspicious of British motives in Madagascar. There was a lot of suspicion that the British were taking Madagascar so that they could add it to the British Empire at the expense of the French one. Leaflets had been dropped on Diego Sura to try and explain why they were taking it, and pointing out that once the war was over, it would go back to the French and so on. They might have taken more note of these leaflets if they hadn't arrived at the same time that French sailors were being bombed. Admiral Siffre, who was the overall commander, said something like, stories of what the recipients did with them would have surprised the originators.
De Gaulle's then informed, isn't he, once the port's taken? What's his reaction to being kept out of it?
He was really unhappy. He was furious. I mean, he famously had a temper. I think publicly he tried to say, this is good news. The island is coming over to the right side. And he believed that as soon as the Allies landed, all the French, they would go, oh, great, brilliant, we're on the right side now, which never actually happened. But he always believed that the French on the island would flock to him as soon as they got the chance. He tried not to show it too much in public, but he was absolutely furious, really unhappy.
I got the feeling that de Gaulle was also suspicious of British motives. Hence, he was kept out. That he thought they might, the British might be keen on keeping it and adding it to the empire. It's not that far from South Africa or Kenya. British holders in Africa. Like that. So what changes the British mind? We've taken the port. There was a limited occupation. We can essentially free up all the troops and the shipping, because you say it's a large fleet, to go back and do what it was doing. But we don't, do we? What makes them change their mind to persuade them to British to try and capture the whole island?
The SOE agents on the island had argued that they needed to take the whole island from the start. And Jan Smuts, the South African Prime Minister, was always keen to take the whole island. What they were trying to do was what Churchill had always feared. I mean, Churchill had said on a couple of occasions that it was supposed to be a help, not a hindrance. But whenever they were just holding the northern part of the island, it was a hindrance because it couldn't support itself. Whereas if they had the whole island, then it was self-sufficient, and there was a lot less logistics involved in trying to get things there and support the place. There was an attempt to get along with the Vichy French on the rest of the island, but tensions were never very good.
Did the Axis make any attempt to aid the Vichy forces on the island?
The Germans certainly didn't. I mean, they wouldn't even allow the French to send any more forces there. But the Japanese had some submarines operating in the area. One submarine in particular, their crew ended up on the island and ended up being captured by a group of Royal Marines. Neither of them did a great deal, to be honest. As I said, I think it was a submarine division that was operating. There were like 2 or 3 submarines from the Japanese, but it was more of the submarines happened to be operating there than they really tried to help the French hang on to the island.
Mm. The French Vichy governor, I wonder, how is he viewed at the time? It's an interesting figure because he could be a hero, traitor, villain.
It really depends on which side you're looking from. The Vichy government loved him. He was doing exactly what they wanted. So whenever he was holding out, they could use that as they could turn to the Germans and say, look, we are fighting. We are, we're not just sitting back. We are actively opposing the Allies. I
wondered how much that actually was good for Vichy to be able to say that to the Germans. We are our own people and not a patsy of anybody else. That sort of level of independence. So the next stage is to capture the rest of the island. How does that go? I mean, are the French forces any more willing to surrender as the British press south? I mean, I can't remember what are these operations called? They've got a good name. Streamline.
Streamline J.
But it's Streamline and J. So they're 3 separate operations that fall into Streamline J, which sounds like some train or a plane or something. So how are those operations for the British? They push down the island. I mean, as I say, it's a big island to occupy,
and it's largely a jungle. So it was. At that point, it wasn't just British. The two of the three divisions that were involved in the initial assault had moved on to India, but the 29th Brigade was still there, and they were joined by the 22nd East Africa Infantry Brigade, which had units from various parts of Africa. There was Kenyans, Nyasaland, Uganda, and there were aircraft and armoured cars from South Africa. So it was a much more international operation at this point. And it was a slow slog. Internal communications on the island weren't great. I mean, back when the French were trying to take it from the natives in like the 19th century, the Queen at the time deliberately kept the roads not very good to hinder the French. You know, they hadn't improved that much from then. So you had to advance along quite narrow roads. There were an awful lot of rivers to cross. And the French, of course, kept blowing the bridges although in one particular case, there was a suspension bridge. And rather than blow it, the French cut the cables, and so the bridge just dropped. The Allies arrived and were like, oh, bridge is blown, damn it. And then they realised that actually it was just sitting on the bed of the river, and it wasn't that deep, and they could actually still drive across. But it was a long, slow, hard operation. It was pretty relentless. There were very few, I don't think there were ever actually reverses as such, but the French kept stopping them and slowing them down. And
it's struck me as being a long withdrawal by the French, that they oppose every opportunity and then just withdraw rather than hold the line. But what struck me as well is, considering the whole point was not to draw away troops all the time. It's drawn away troops from Burma, and it's not just troops. It's landing craft. That there's operations cancelled because this comes later in the war, isn't it? Problems with landing craft. We just don't have enough of them. It's doing the opposite of what it was meant to do. It's not this short, sharp shock.
Very much so, yeah. In total, it was about 6 months, the campaign, and it was a drain the whole time. It was exactly what Churchill feared, really.
It finishes just as El Alamein goes in. So again, their troops being drawn away from that North Africa, where it's reached that tipping point. So as the Allies occupy the island, how do they treat the Vichy French? I mean, that must be a problem for them. Do you occupy the island as an occupier, or how do you treat the French? Or do you hand them straight over to be free French, at which place you shave a tier of bureaucracy off and replace it with free French?
They treat the prisoners quite well, and they gave the prisoners the opportunity to either be prisoners of war for the rest of the war, or to join the Free French. And on the whole, the French went, no, we're Vichy, we're not going over to de Gaulle. But there were quite a few Senegalese troops there who joined the Free French. As for the occupation, the British occupied it and ran it for some time. There was some argument about whether they should hand it over to the Free French, and the Free French obviously were very keen for it to be handed over. I think it's fair to say that Churchill basically used it as a bit of a carrot for de Gaulle, in a sort of like, if you play ball, then you can have Madagascar sort of thing. It was finally handed over to them in January 1943. Initially, it was for the Free French, it was General Legentilhomme who ran it, who was quite a famous general, I believe, but he wasn't really much of an administrator. And from May, a guy called Pierre de Saint-Marc took over. He was much better at the bureaucracy and whatever was needed, but his biggest problem was that the local population wanted more independence, and the French National Committee wouldn't give any promises about that.
I say, hang on to what we've got. So what happens to the governor? I mean, he's eventually pushed all the way to right to the south of the island, isn't he, for his sort of last desperate holdout? What happens to him?
And he did just kept like retreating until he just eventually had nowhere else to go. He eventually surrendered, but the surrender, he sent a representative to the British to talk about surrender terms. The Vichy French had nothing to bargain with, really. So, it was realistically, it was so, where do I sign? But he managed to put them off until after midnight. He signed the document at just after midnight, but that meant that the campaign had gone on for 6 months, which meant that the French soldiers were entitled to a campaign medal and a greater pension because they'd been fighting for 6 months.
Fantastic bureaucrat. Did the Allies, did the island prove any benefit for the Allies?
It was a great source of some really important raw materials. It's not clear whether they were able to get them. I haven't seen anything that indicated whether or not they were able to get them before they took the island. Things like graphite and mica and rubber all come from Madagascar, and they're all important. But the one that I didn't realise until I researched this was that the Manhattan Project for the atomic bomb needed a huge amount of graphite, and it had to be high quality graphite, which is Madagascar is a good source for. And within a few days of Annette surrendering, there were thousands of tons of graphite being shipped off to Los Alamos.
It's a really interesting point that, they probably hadn't made the connection at the start of the campaign, but by the end of the campaign, the speed of the Manhattan Project was going. It's where we're going to get the graphite from. It's like heavens, we've just taken Madagascar.
It's very much a what if, but presumably the Japanese had no idea of the importance of this. But, if the Japanese had helped Vichy to defend it and, if they hadn't been able to take it.
Would it have pushed back the Manhattan Project?
Yeah, and what effect would that have had? It's just things that seem completely unrelated.
Well, if we're starting to discuss what if, it's probably time to call a halt. Thank you. Loyal listener, if you're interested in knowing more about the battle for Madagascar, Russell's book is A Strange Campaign. And if you want to hear more of Russell, spool back through the World War II podcast feed to episode 27, where we discussed Operation Anthropoid, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, and the destruction of the Czech village of Lidice as a reprisal by the Germans. Not only was the village physically destroyed, all the visible remains were removed. So that's episode 27. Well, that's all from me for now. Hopefully in the next episode, we'll be looking at the British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke. Until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.